Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Chilterns te monga, ko Thames te awa. Ko Paiheratia te waka. Ko Southwark te iwi, ko Ilsley Embleton te hapu. Louise Embleton Tudor aho. I was born in London, and it was in London that I first met Farhad in 1984. We were both in a group which was part of our psychotherapy training at the Minster Centre. I was a somewhat scared and green first year, and he was a seasoned second year. But then, as now, one of the things which struck me about Farhad is his ability to make a serious point in a humorous way. Subsequent to being students at the Minster Centre, we were both invited to teach. Radical psychiatry and, of course, gender were hot topics at the time. But Farhad enabled the organisation to begin to seriously address and incorporate issues around race, culture, equality and power, both in the training and in the consulting room. Farhad has gone on to publish 3 books on related issues, and his presentation today is based on the latest of those books. The book is titled Thought Paralysis, The Virtues of Discrimination. As someone who was involved in the politics of race in England in the 1980s, and then as a trainer and facilitator in the field of equal opportunities and anti-discriminatory practice in the late 80s and early 90s, as someone who cares about injustice and wants to avoid hurting and offending other people, and who sometimes resents the formulae of political correctness, this book directly addressed me. It satisfied me and it confronted me. It is philosophy at its best, inviting the reader to examine both the commonplace and the sophisticated. I'll not now dwell on Farhad's consummate skills as a writer, but I do want to mention that it's a pity that this book, being classified understandably as it is under psychotherapy, makes it less accessible than it really ought to be to anybody who is concerned about equality and who cares about the other. Farhad was born in India and he lived in London for most of his life. He was a teacher before he became a psychotherapist. Subsequently, he trained as a group analyst, and he is now a training analyst with the IGA, the Institute of Group Analysis in London. He lives with his partner, Angelica, who is here, and we're very pleased to welcome you, Angelica, also. And they lived in Devon, in the southwest of England, where Farhad has an independent private practice as a group analyst and facilitator with teams and working with individuals. So it is now my great pleasure and my great privilege to welcome Dr. Farhad Dalal.
Kia ora koutou. I'm very proud of that. But what a lovely introduction. Thank you. Thank you. I want to say thanks to our hosts, Louise and Keith, because we really have been welcomed like royalty, but also the way we've been received in this conference, so, which I'd say is with love. So thank you. I have to say that this is probably the most foreign experience I've ever had in my life, what I'm going through. And, and at the same time, strangely familiar. The workshop I attended yesterday, Tau Kumi Kumi, really speaks entirely to my talk today. So it is this strange mix of different and similar. And I'm just, over the last 24 hours, I'm just beginning to understand the significance of this conference and the enormity of what you are trying to do, not just in the field relevant to the field of psychotherapy, but to the nation itself. So I just begin to understand that. And I've understood that one ought to start with a song. Alas, I have no voice, but fortunately, I happen to have married somebody who does. So I would like to invite my wife, Angelica, up here to do a little something that when I first heard touched me deeply. So if you wouldn't mind. What? Is there a marital therapist here? So we arrived on Saturday, and on Sunday we went up, Rangi Toto, Keith, Angelica, me, and Viramu. And it's suddenly, I should say that I was married to a Kiwi, a Pakeha, from a Pakeha family from Onehunga. And so I visited this land about, I would say, about a dozen times over 20 years. And as I was speaking to Viramu, it suddenly struck me, this is the first time I'm having a conversation with a Maori. What a thing. And now this family that I was a part of were good, decent people. And yet it seemed like their lives ran in a parallel world. So it seems, what is going on? Well, how is it that in those 20 plus years, the only Maori I spoke to was the odd one in a gift shop? And it seems to me that this is some kind of racism in operation, but not in the old violent kind. It's a very modern, efficient racism that does its work without violence. It is invisible, and it is everywhere. An example of the kind of subtle ways it is everywhere. Where do I point? Okay. From 10 years ago, for you Star Trek fans, it says, celebrate 35 years of Star Trek and meet the latest captain of the Enterprise. In those 35 years, there are two captains who are missing, a woman and a black man. So, subtle at work. Now, liberalism's stand against racism is encapsulated by its ethical principle, to live and to let live. But in actual fact, this is two principles. The first is for the requirement for you to live your life freely and fully, to live, and the second is for you to allow others to also to do the same, to let live. And in between these two principles sits the lubricant called tolerance, helping to ease the frictions between the two. The idea of tolerance is found in all ethical systems, secular and religious, all over the world. Tolerance is self-evidently a virtue, and I say this with no ironic intent. But on closer examination, the notion of tolerance is not as straightforward as it first seems, because it is often taken up in a very simplistic sense, and when it is, it can be and often is turned into an instrument of fear and control. You must tolerate. And tolerance is mostly thought of in relation to ethics, but it also has a lot to do with politics. For example, is it tolerance or something else that is called for in New Zealand today when we think about the relationship between the Pākehā and the Maori, or the struggles that are taking place in regards to registration of psychotherapists? Two heavily charged questions which I leave hanging. But before I speak about tolerance itself, I need to prepare the ground for it. I will do this by describing to you the European historical stage onto which tolerance will make its entry. There are other stories to be told about tolerance, but I draw on this one as it is the one that has come to hold most sway over much of the world today. Anyhow, in this task, I start with the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was a challenge to the unfair old world order that prevailed in the Middle Ages, where there was one rule for the privileged and another for the rest. The Enlightenment's great cry was equality for all. It said that whether one was prince, priest, or pauper, all were to be treated equally. And to ensure that they were treated equally, it deliberately kept the specifics out of each human life out of the picture. It mattered not whether you were black or white, man or woman, landowner or farmhand. It mattered not. The Enlightenment privileged the universal individual. It said that each individual was to be treated with respect simply because they are a person. You are to be treated with respect despite your differences. Well, in time, the Enlightenment worldview was challenged by the Romantics, and it came about, well, this is one of the stories of how it came about. The Enlightenment required each person to work out for themselves what was a good ethical life, rather than just believe what was being said to them, what was being claimed by the princes and priests. And philosophers like Kant and others thought, I've just lost my page, presumed that if ordinary people, if they each freely thought about what was a good life, they would all arrive at the same conclusion. But this did not happen. Intelligent people arrived at very different conclusions about what is a good life. And so rather than uniformity, there was diversity. And this precipitated a moral crisis. How was a person to orientate themselves when faced with this confusion of possibilities? The old moral compasses were no longer available. The Romantics answered that each person has to look within, where each will find their own unique moral compass. And this moral compass was not in the rational mind, but the heart. Their injunction is that you should follow your feelings, and that it is your ethical duty to live authentically in harmony with them. The Romantics turned what was a problem for the Enlightenment, the sort of range of differences in beliefs, into a virtue. They became the champions of uniqueness and difference. So in contrast to the Enlightenment, the Romantics privileged the particular individual, and its ethos was that each person is to be treated with respect because of their difference. So this, in a way, is the first problem. Liberalism in general, and contemporary equality movements in particular, have not taken sufficient account of the conflict between these two sets of values, the conflict between despite and because. Value me despite my difference, value me because of my difference. Anyhow, the subject that both these movements were initially addressing was the individual. Both were agreed that the beliefs and ways of individuals were to be respected, and that the state should not interfere in their private lives and so on. But then, some later Romantics like Herder changed the game. They came to think that cultures too are living things, and so they transposed the sets of rights and duties belonging to individuals onto cultures. Now, like individuals, cultures should be respected for what they are on their own terms. The state should not interfere in their private life. And cultures had an ethical duty to live authentically according to their internal beliefs and principles. This is the beginning, if you like, of multiculturalism. Now, whilst all of this is going on, already the European imperial adventure had been going on for some time. The imperialists had been riding roughshod over the cultures of the territories they conquered, actively denigrating, pillaging, and decimating them. And as conquerors are wont to do, they imposed their own culture onto those that they conquered. So the multiculturalist ethos is a challenge to the imperialist one. It demands that the imperialist stays their already bloodied hand, saying that each culture is to be respected on its own terms and not be interfered with. This gives us, forgot to click. This gives us its well-known strapline, different but equal. But why was it? It was thought about. Why was it that people of one cultural group often seem to feel hostility and antipathy to the ways of other cultural groups? Why is this? Well, the multiculturalist answer is very similar to the psychoanalytic one, and both think that strangeness and unfamiliarity evoke fear and hostility. So the multiculturalist solution is familiarization and education. And they call on understanding, the light of reason, to dispel the darkness of ignorance. And therefore their work, the multiculturalist work, is in the conscious realm. The psychoanalysts, meanwhile, thought that the work that needed to take place was in the realm of the unconscious, because they presumed this is where the roots of these fears and hostilities were to be found. Now, I think there is much in each of these ideas, but in themselves, they are not nearly enough. And this was the view of the anti-racists. In Britain, in the 1970s and 80s, the anti-racist movement disagreed with the multiculturalists to say that the difficulties were less to do with prejudice born of ignorance and more to do with power relations and oppression. And they said to the psychoanalysts, you are just psychologizing the problem. And they said, rather than put energy into educating and psychoanalyzing the oppressors, they demanded a change to the power structures of the land. Their militancy brought about many positive changes in British society, but they lived in too polarized a world, too black and white. They accepted that all people were capable of prejudice, but thought that only whites could be racist because of their formula, racism equals power plus prejudice. And they could hold this idea because they had a very simplistic two-state reading of power. Either you had power or you did not. Either you were an oppressor or you were the oppressed. So in the last 2 decades or so, an apparently more nuanced movement has taken the stage, the diversity movement. It claims to speak for all differences, not just of those of culture, race, disability, and gender, and so on. It positions itself differently to the previous egalitarian movements because it makes it a point of pride to say that it is apolitical. It changes the game. It changes the game to say that differences are not problems, as previously thought, but assets, and assets are to be celebrated. So, and this gives forth their strapline, celebrating differences. Now, there is no need of tolerance, because differences are being welcomed. The celebrating diversity movement, in Europe at least, has become ubiquitous. It has found favor everywhere in organizational life as well as with policymakers. For example, here is the logo of an organizational consultancy group, and it promotes the notion of inclusivity with this strapline, valuing all sorts over these suites that are all sorts. Well, my question is, should I value all sorts? If I do not, am I being judgmental and oppressive in some way? What if I think one of these sorts is toxic to my well-being? And how do I know if my antipathy to this sort is grounded in reality or its ignorant prejudice? Is it the case that it is my ethical duty to nevertheless to try to tolerate this possibly toxic sort? Well, the rest of the paper can be thought of as an engagement with these kinds of questions. Much psychological theory, despite tipping its hat in the direction of relationality, proceeds as though the individual is prior to the social, as though individuals are born with pre-social true selves, and when these individuals decide to live together with other individuals, they happen to form society. This makes society optional. Further, and unfortunately, the true nature of these individuals becomes contaminated and distorted when they try and live with others. Rousseau. But also much philosophy in psychotherapy. So in contrast, the line I follow is a reversal of this kind of individualism, in which the social is prior to the particular individual. Each individual is born into a pre-existing social. And so I argue that the I, the me, is constituted out of the varieties of we that one is born into. This does not do away with the uniqueness of each individual. It does not make us all uniform. For example, our faces are recognizably unique, despite the fact that each of them is made up of the same chemical ingredients. The internal, the personal, is not outside or prior to the social. Rather, the personal is the communal personalized. In other words, individuals are deeply, profoundly, and entirely enculturated from the first. This is at the heart of the multiculturalist rationale as to why we should be respectful of others. My very being, my moral sensibilities, my sense of right and wrong are all derived and imbibed from the communities that I am part of. As the philosopher Raymond Geiter has said, and I quote, "We cannot radically rescind from the ethical constitution of our inner lives without becoming unintelligible to ourselves." It's worth just letting the repercussions of that go through your mind. But if we stop here, what we would have done is actually created a rationale for racism. If cultures are hermetically sealed, if people are so entirely different, if their beliefs and practices are incommensurate, then the only way that each would be able to preserve their integrity is by a radical separation from the other. This, of course, is what many people think. They would say to me that as I am not a black woman, then I have no right to speak about matters that pertain to them. Well, we are rescued from this existential horror by plurality. I am not born into one community, but into a number of overlapping communities, and often enough, the values of each are in conflict with the values of others. All of which, so I'm born into multiple communities, and I take this sort of conflictual relationship into me. And on this basis, I argue that the I, the me, is not a unity, but a conflicted multiplicity. I'm now going to state the issue that is at the heart of the problematic of how to live and let live. Click. Okay. I have just been saying that they are constituted out of the mix of cultural milieus that they are born into. Their culturally formed beliefs and values are integral to their sense of personhood, so much so that to go against them would constitute a grave psychological injury, a trauma even. But all this is also true of the us. So my question now is this: what should I do when I find myself faced with beliefs and ways of life that go against my own deeply held beliefs and ways of life? How can I manage the multiculturalist injunction that I should remain respectful to them and their ways? It seems to me that the way the situation stands at the moment, the only way I could manage this feat of respecting their ways and sensibilities is by abdicating from my own ethical sensibilities, by cutting off from them. In this way of thinking, the cost of allowing them their authenticity seems to be that I would lose touch with my authenticity. But then I would be no longer human, because as Gaita says, in doing so, I would have become unintelligible to myself. I would have betrayed myself, and in so doing, lost something of myself. Is the only other alternative tyranny? What is to be done? We find ourselves in this apparent impasse because we are using a simplistic understanding of culture. The thing is that just by using the very phrase, say, English culture, I create an illusion of coherence and uniformity. But when I look at in any depth at English culture, it disintegrates into a number of conflicting and overlapping ways of life, each with their own frameworks of good and bad, right and wrong, from football, vegan, left-wing radical, minor, eco-warrior, hedonist, capitalist, and so on. George Bush, the Ku Klux Klan, and Obama all claim to speak for the American way. Islam has its bloody feuds between Shia, Sunni, and Wahhabi. The Church of England is riven with a range of radically different values and beliefs. The untouchables experience of Hindu culture is going to be very different to that of the Brahmin. The same is true of our schools of psychotherapy. There is not just one way, there is not the psychoanalytic way of doing things, as there is not just the transactional analyst way of doing things. Because each of these ways, in a way, defines what is considered to be a transgression. Well, here's the thing. Cultural practices are not only a means of distinguishing us and an us from a them. We cover our heads in holy places, they do not. The cultural practices are also the means of policing those who are deemed to be a part of the us. So cultural practices and beliefs are, amongst other things, institutionalized rationales of domination and oppression. Cultural practices are, amongst other things, it's not only this, but amongst other things, sedimented power relations. They explain why it is only men that may become priests, or why it is right and proper that the genitalia of women should be mutilated, or why one kind of person is entitled to resources and the other is not, because it is so written. It is not coincidental that the most vocal defenders of cultural practices are those that benefit the most from the ways those cultures are structured. And they defend them often by invalidating any voice that questions the ethics of some practice, because the voice is not one of us. They might also claim that the mere temerity to question proves that the questioner is undoubtedly a racist bigot. This move, it has to be said, is a very clever one, because it decouples politics from culture for political ends. It uses the rationale of culture to disguise and legitimize forms of oppression as cultural practice. And in the main, it is the womenfolk who mainly find themselves at the wrong end of things. Mostly, we think that differences just exist out there, and we see them, and we name them. And then we think the difficulties that arise across these differences arise because of the differences are the causes of the difficulties. But consider, any two people are the same as each other on a range of categories, and at the same moment, they are different to each other on a range of other categories. And both are true at the same time. So in this moment, do you experience me as the same as you or different to you? If you are experiencing me as the same, why? And what have you done with the differences? And if you are experiencing me as different, once again, why? And what have you done with the similarities? When I've been casually using the words us and them, where have you found yourself locating yourself? In the us or the them or whatever. It is not that there are no differences between us, rather that there are multiple differences and simultaneously multiple similarities between us. And what we need to think about is why we end up amplifying one difference or similarity over the rest. When one difference is made prominent, made figure, then the others don't just become background, they entirely disappear. For me, this is a key difficulty with the idea of biculturalism. Its danger being that it replaces the hegemony of the colonialist culture with the hegemony of two cultures. So I'm saying that I cannot simply respect their culture because it is not just one thing. It is many conflictual things. There is no such thing in Britain, as is talked about, as the black community. The fact that black people tend to be recipients of prejudice and racism does not make them a community. Like the category English, black people are bankers, bakers, and criminals too. And I rather like that because we have half of UK's young black men are out of work, and above them is a picture of a person who happens to be black, who clearly is not part of that headline. So it's too easy to do this. Similarly, there is no universal spokesperson for the Islamic community in the UK. There are only spokespersons for specific interest groups. Mr. Tony Blair thought otherwise. He spoke with imams, taking them to be the designated authority for the Islamic community, and in so doing, he undermined and silenced the many secular, progressive Islamic voices in the population. Interestingly, when one of the English archbishops dares to make a public statement critical of the government's social policy, the government is outraged. Priests ought to stick to the ecclesiastical domain. They have no business interfering in the politics of the land. This despite the fact that the bishops of the Church of England all have a right to an unelected seat in the House of Lords. Well, here is a not uncommon example to just draw out the points a woman living and brought up in an Orthodox context wants to marry someone outside that community. The father is outraged and decides the only way to manage the situation is to ensure that she never meets her beloved. What are we to do? The first problem we have to get through is that of the liberal taboo, that we should not interfere in the private lives of others. This is an issue that is internal to their culture, and we should let them sort it out themselves. But if we do this, then we give tacit support to the more powerful in the dispute, the father. The woman is calling on the values of the Enlightenment. She says, it is by virtue of me just being a person, I have the right to decide my destiny in the way I choose. The father, meanwhile, draws on romantic values. He says, you are a particular human being, in a particular society, in a particular time, and you have duties, therefore, towards them. Her choices will bring shame onto the family, and so is morally wrong. Now, as a witness, if I do not allow myself either of the twin luxuries of apathy or non-interference, then I'm obliged to decide which party I am to support. There are two things here. First, that in tolerating or respecting one part of them, I am necessarily disrespecting another part of them. Second, my decision-making process is necessarily a discriminatory process. I have to make a decision as to what I will respect. And I cannot help but draw on my own value system to make that decision. Indeed, it is my capacity to discriminate that makes me moral. To stop discriminating is to stop thinking. It is to rescind from my ethical constitution. It is to stop being human. This is the point. Discrimination is not the opposite of tolerance, but integral to it. The problem then is not discrimination, but unfair discrimination. So it is only now that I have finally arrived at the subject that is central to this paper, tolerance. What is the mechanism of tolerance? What am I tolerating? Well, when I thought about it, I realized that although I think I'm tolerating something outside me, what I'm actually doing is tolerating a feeling of discomfort arising in me in response to that something out there. The next thing I realized was that not all differences require tolerance. As a meat eater and atheist, I find it very easy to spend a convivial evening with vegetarians and deists. I have no difficulty in enjoying the differences between skirts, sarongs, and saris, or celebrating the different virtues of chapatis, pancakes, and tortillas. In these situations, I'm not required to tolerate anything. Tolerance is required when faced with something difficult. Third, I don't know if I should have clicked or not. Third, although tolerance appears to be primarily a conscious activity, it is nevertheless impregnated with unconscious motivation. And if and when we speak of tolerance in the abstract, as we mostly do, then we can make it seem that tolerance is a universal virtue, a capacity readily available to all people, if only they were virtuous enough to make use of it. But human life is not lived in the abstract. It is always situated in a mix of power relations. And when viewed in this light, we will see revealed a powerful asymmetry when tolerance is practiced by the more powerful in contrast to the less powerful. The less powerful are constantly required to put up with the whims and expectations of the more powerful. The master of the house casually humiliates the servant. The servant swallows hard, subjugates the rage, and endures the humiliation. This is a kind of tolerance, but it is also perhaps more akin to endurance. Tolerance of this kind of the underdog goes on all the time, but it is not recognized as the activity of tolerance because it is taken for granted. In contrast, when the more powerful person is slighted in some way, they have choices. And it is because they have choices that their decision to forgive looks magnanimous. Tolerance by the more powerful is a kind of patronage, a gift that can be withheld as easily as given. So, the tolerance of the underdog is continual and invisible, while the occasional dispensations of tolerance by the more powerful are noticed and applauded. And of the two, the tolerance spoken of by the multiculturalists are the ones of the more powerful. Now, even though I consider myself to be a more or less ethical being, my decisions as to whether to tolerate and what to tolerate is not always ethical, nor is it ever fully rational. I know that I am much less likely to tolerate some obnoxious behavior, say in a driving situation, from someone that I do not feel intimidated by. I know that if the man talking loudly in the quiet carriage of the train compartment is drunk, large, and tattooed, then like the servant, I am much more likely to grin and bear it. But what is the cost to me in those situations? Say I do nothing when I witness some bullying behavior, either because the bully is my boss or frightening in some way. I am more than likely to feel some mix of guilt, shame, and humiliation. These feelings are experienced as attacks on the self, made all the worse because I am complicit in their creation. On the outside, it looks like peaceful acceptance, but on the inside, there is no peace. There is disturbance and turbulence. It is this discomfort that I will find myself tolerating. Now, one way of coping with these difficult emotions is to deny and displace them onto the victim. Somehow, they come to be construed as being to blame for what is happening. Speculating, something of this might be occurring when a crowd suddenly transforms itself into a baying mob, turning on a hapless victim. We can see then that tolerance, the activity of tolerance, is a continual difficult work, coping with something that is testing us on all kinds of levels, psychological, political, and ethical. And we ought not to forget the importance of the distinction between tolerating something that is disagreeable, say a bad smell, and tolerating something I deem to be morally wrong. These are very different situations, each with very different requirements, but often little or no distinction is made between them. So, we have seen that the project of trying to live and let live is not one in which anything goes. Rather, it is a state of tension due to the call of these two duties. The first duty being to be true to yourself, and the second, a spirit of tolerance and generosity towards others. Surprising as it may sound, for things to remain meaningful, the tension ought not to be dissolved. And this now speaks to the pre-conference workshop exactly. And the reasons as to why this is the case is made apparent by looking at the three ways in which it is dissolved. For the imperialist and fundamentalist, there is no tension at all. There is only certainty about their own beliefs, and so they do away with the second duty, to let others live. So their stance is, my way or no way. Meanwhile, the diversity enthusiast dissolves the tension by capitulating on the first duty to themselves. They end up with the position, I defer to your way and celebrate it. The shame and guilt that they might feel because of having abandoned their own ethical frameworks is defended against by a manic positivity, which they call celebration. They come to fetishize otherness. And last, the liberal does manage apparently to abide by both duties, but by the device of not having much to do with them. The haves live in one borough, and the must-not-haves live in another. The haves do not have much to do, a bit like my initial story. They don't have much to do with the must-not-haves. And so they can create a benign and complacent view of themselves. I'm not doing anything wrong or bad in the way I'm living my life. So although it looks like their ethic is one of live and let live, it is actually live and leave well alone. What we can see from these three situations is that the tension is being dissolved by breaking the connection between the us and the them. But if we are to endure the contact, then we will have to give up on one of the fundamental ideals, not only of liberalism, but also our profession. This being the ideal of neutrality and non-judgmental respect. As we saw earlier, in the case of the woman and father, apparent non-interference is actually active support for the more powerful. But now, let us go further. To be neutral requires me to see and experience something and not have a response to it. Or if I do have a response to it, then at the very least to detach myself from that response. And if I do have a response, which I choose not to follow through on, then as we saw earlier, I will have broken with my ethical self. But how can I not have a response? Humans are entirely responsive beings. They cannot help but continually respond to their context. Human responsivity is analogous to the law of physics, which says that there can be no action without a reaction. This is also entirely true of human reaction. Responsivity is but another way of talking about our capacity for empathy. But let me persevere some more. How can I engender in myself a state of neutrality when I witness some activity within the them? The liberal injunction is that what goes on in their private lives should be no concern of mine. But the only way I can manage this is if I feel no concern. Another way of putting it is to say that I should inhibit my responsivity to such a degree that I should have no response. This follows seamlessly out of the same liberal injunction, which we can reframe as one which says that my responsibility and therefore responsivity ends with me and mine, and what happens to them is not my responsibility. But the only way I can do this is to cut off and have no feelings, to amputate my capacity for empathy. But in so doing, I would have become unintelligible to myself. I will have dehumanized myself. To be neutral is to be hard and hardened. We can see then that the ideal of neutrality and non-judgmentalism, which are humane principles, can actually lead to their opposite, creating a radical rupture between the us and the them. There is one last deadly problem that I need to touch on, a problem which ironically is generated by the liberational movements themselves as they battle for the liberty of the less powerful. And it is seen at its clearest in the latter stages of the colonial situation. As Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, and others have shown, the colonizing process was devastating in its range and fury. Not only did the colonizer colonize the land, it also colonized the minds of the native. And one of the ways it did this was to destroy the language, culture, and traditions of the native and replace it with the language, ways, and culture of the colonizer. Now, in their struggle towards liberation, the colonized counter the colonialist worldview by emphasizing and reclaiming the traditional worldview. What can happen now is a reversal, in which the colonized say to the colonizer, "It is we who do not recognize your ways as having any legitimacy in our land." But in utilizing tradition as a weapon against the ways of the colonizer, there is an inevitable tendency to idealize the old ways and the good old days. It can come to pass that any questioning or criticism of tradition is experienced as attack, betrayal, or sacrilege. We see something of this kind, this dynamic, happening in all over the world today, not only in regards to Islam, but in many of the old colonies. So it can come to pass that the struggle for liberation can create, but not necessarily so, a mindset in the marginalized, in the dispossessed, as rigid as that in the more powerful colonizer. The philosopher Bertrand Russell picks up on this theme in a slightly different way. Sorry, I'll just skip that. Okay, so Bertrand Russell. He noticed that the liberals and progressives of his day tended to idealize the working classes and the dispossessed generally. He took them to task, saying that they were suffering the fallacy of the superior virtue of the oppressed. In other words, they presumed that the suffering of the dispossessed had ennobled them and made them wise. This attitude continues even today in many circles, liberal and left. To imagine that the dispossessed are necessarily wise is like countering the racist slur, all blacks are thieves, with the foolish assertion that no black person is ever a thief. Racialized thinking is always a generalized thinking. It says they are all the same. The irony here is that the defense continues to use the racialized mindset of the racist. Before, they were uniformly bad because they are black. Now they are uniformly good also because they are black. The real counter to racialized thinking is discriminatory thinking, and the courage to say, on the occasion you think it to be true, that that person who happens to be black is bad. But of course, this is difficult to say because of the fear of being branded a racist, because although what you have uttered is that person is bad, you might be construed as actually believing that that person is bad because they are black. Anyhow, all this can get caught up in the activity of tolerance. The other can become idealized, and this leads the liberal into a thought paralysis. In any dispute, he thinks that he's bound to unquestioningly tolerate and accept the views and actions of the other. Unquestioning tolerance is folly, because there is an ocean of difference between causing offense and being offensive. A certain kind of frightened liberal is unable to distinguish between them because they are in the grip of the fallacy of the superior virtue of the oppressed. In any engagement, they immediately collapse and defer to the other because they have caused offense. I do think it wrong for me to be deliberately offensive, to insult or intentionally offend my hosts. But it might be that my hosts find themselves offended by some of my beliefs and practices. And I would urge that it is not the case that I should now immediately and necessarily retract and mute myself. I need to hold the tension and examine the situation. Much so-called cross-cultural and diversity training in organizations does not take sufficient account of the distinction between being offensive and causing offense. And so they end up being banal trainings in etiquette, a training in how not to offend exotic people. Ironically, in so doing, they are perpetuating and reinforcing the divide between the us and the exotic them. Having just spoken of instances where they might be offended, let me turn it around and return to the question I posed with the all sorts suites. What am I to do when I am the offended party? Should I even try to tolerate something which I find intolerable? The thing is, I cannot trust my response. Just because something feels right does not make it right. That is where the romantics went wrong. How do I know whether this antipathy I feel in me is born of projection or some version of racialized prejudice, or whether it is indeed an ethical response. I know that there are some things I cannot and will not tolerate, because to tolerate it will be, in my view, unethical. The worldviews of the pederast, or the racial supremacist, or the homophobe, for example. In these situations, I would argue, the ethical response is intolerance. In these matters, I am not open-minded. Does this make me a fundamentalist? Or to put it another way, what is the difference between me and the fundamentalist, given that the fundamentalist too believes that their stance is an ethical one? Now, my beliefs, my stance is centric, like the fundamentalist. It is local. There is no godlike objective position from which to judge one against the other. As a philosopher, Thomas Nagel said, there is no, which he called the view from nowhere. So, what do we do? At first sight, it seems that the only options in the situations are the ones we met earlier, annihilating the self or annihilating the other. The fundamentalist, of course, would choose the latter. Meanwhile, because there is no objective way of choosing between the two viewpoints, the relativist refuses both operations and ends up with thought paralysis. Now, although I am convinced by the ethics of my response, I also recognize my centricity, the partiality of my knowledge, and so on. Because of this, I also know that although I firmly believe what I believe, my view is not unassailable. Therefore, I am always open to interrogation. It is this that rescues me from the charge of being fundamentalist, my vulnerability to being interrogated. If, and it is a big if both parties are simultaneously inclined, then we would engage in something I would call conflictual politico-ethical conversation. But if not, there is no virtue in me trying to tolerate the intolerant, because this would be suicide. As in effect, I would be tolerating someone coming at me whilst wielding a hatchet. But even if conversation is possible, for me to propose some notion of conversation at the conclusion of this paper probably comes across as a bit limp and totally banal. But the kind of conversation I'm referring to is anything but banal. It is actually quite frightening. The kind of deep politico-ethical conversation that I'm referring to is something much more than debate and an intellectual exchange of ideas. The kind of deep conversation I am talking about entails an exchange of ideological fluids. It is a transformational process, and I truly do not know if I am capable of it. I find within me an enormous reluctance to know the world from the viewpoint of my disputant, because the effect of doing so might be that I will be changed. And if so, I will have lost some of what makes me, me. I fear engagement in this kind of process because of the possibility that through it I will become a stranger to myself. I would become other to myself. Let me just draw together the points I've made in this paper. Okay. First is that I am arguing that cultures are political assemblies, and all attempts to decouple culture from politics ought to be resisted. Second, that the notion of figure and ground is not as benign as it appears. There are elements to it that are violent. Figure subjugates ground. Third, that tension and conflict are integral to the human condition. Fourth, the fact That I have no access to the view from nowhere does not mean that I ought to abdicate on my viewpoints. Rather, it remains my duty to hold on to them and to engage in conflictual ethical dialogue, to test and be tested. Indiscriminate tolerance is harmful to all concerned. And finally, deference to the other is as problematic as denigration of the other. I am unable to speak to them if I place them below me, and I'm unable to speak with them if I place them above me. Perhaps the real challenge of this conference is to stand eye to eye, nose to nose, to try to meet each other and lose some of what we think precious in that encounter. Thanks.
Farhad, thank you for a very rich and very relevant talk for us. And we'll now invite questions and responses. Susan will be wandering up the middle aisle with a roving microphone. So if you just raise your hand if you'd like to respond to a question. Yeah, at the back there. Yes, Barbara. Barbara.
Thank you, Farhad. Brief comment. The licorice all sorts. Did you spot where the black one was? Bottom right, under the pile.
Thanks. I'll use that in my next talk. Thanks.
Presentation. I've been reading your books since Christmas, and just watching as you talked, the more and more subtle process of using and theming going on in me just all the time. I'm just very grateful for just beginning to be able to watch that.
Joy, thank you very much for an extraordinary rich presentation. It gave me a lot. It vibrated with a lot of situations I've been struggling with in my own life. But I would like you to comment on what you understand by view from nowhere. Thank you.
Just the impossibility of any objective position outside human life. There is no view from nowhere.
Thank you, Farhad. You spoke wonderfully for me to the tension that we experienced, or I experienced at the end of the cultural supervision Tau Kumi Kumi workshop yesterday, in terms of sameness and difference, and how do I challenge difference, and how do I work out whether that's coming from an ethical point of view or a cultural blindness. So I think what you're offering us is a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Farhad. I was greatly moved by your conversation, and particularly indiscriminate, that holding a conversation where one does not denigrate, but neither does defer. And that seems to be an ongoing conversation at which there's an awful lot at risk. And it seems to me that what can maintain that is some sort of empathic, emotional congruence which can be present in spite that allows this other conversation to take place. I wonder if you'd have any comments about that.
Just the sounds good, but I mean, it is sort of what I'm saying. But the difficulty is having that empathic connection.
Yes.
That's the difficulty.
Yes, that was the point I wanted to make. Thanks.
Don't have a magic answer to that.
Thank you, Farhad, for an incredibly elegant discourse. The question is about pragmatism. If, for instance, I take as my aim how to make accessible psychotherapy to the majority of people in the country, how to get the guy working down by the orange cons into the therapy room, and that sort of thing. Or if I say how to create a series of psychotherapies which represent the cultures of the peoples of this country, how do I actually get from here to there? Then it might seem to me appropriate to sometimes be a romantic and sometimes be a part of the Enlightenment and sometimes be, espouse the view of tolerance and so on. That actually each of these has had a validity depending on the objective that one, I suppose I'm arguing from a kind of Jesuit point of view, that sometimes the end justifies the way you get there.
In Britain, so obviously I'm speaking and have been speaking to you from a particular experience in a particular context, and it won't necessarily fit yours, and certain things turn around and upside down when they move across the world. But it's, well, as they say, it's complicated because on the one hand, there is a similar issue in Britain where psychotherapy tends to be white and all of this kind of a thing. And then you get, in a kind of reaction to that, agencies that sort of grow up, that are sort of more focused to a particular population, blacks here or there. And I can see the value of it. And at the same time, I'm extremely nervous because it's a kind of a ghettoization. And I sort of conceive it a bit like what happened with the women's movement, in the sense that as a sort of moment in a process, that if you are rendered invisible, then you have to make yourself visible, and you coalesce around a certain name, and through which you challenge the center. But in time, that will and should, I would say, dissolve, rather than becoming rigidified. Because it's quite tricky, isn't it? The culturalist discourse looks very similar to the racist discourse. Blood, and so forth. So just because the term culture is being used, it doesn't absolve it. It doesn't remove it from the territory where it needs to be interrogated. But people get very frightened. I get that. I get very frightened. Some of the things I'm saying to you, I feel a bit nervous of, because you really, the notion of biculturalism appears to be very important to you, but it's a problematic notion to me for the sort of reasons I've said. So, but hopefully we can stay in dialogue with our differences and similarities.
Thank you, Farhad. It was quite a thing to listen to your talk, even after reading your thought paralysis book. I tell you how it went in, and in me, I feel very like it is in my tummy like a discomfort, and in my head there's a confusion. And I remember my teacher's word who said, every new thing starts with the tummy pain. And my question to you is you have given to us something that is very, very big. And how to continue this digestion? How to nurture what you have said? Thanks.
Go ahead. I just very briefly, I imagine the conference is that work. You are doing that work in this conference.
Thank you, Farhad. As you know, I really value your thinking, and I kind of admire the capacity you have to describe forces in an almost dispassionate way. And I'm sitting here a bit like Ollie, thinking about the situations one can find oneself in when one discriminates or questions something, and just wanting to put that into the mix, because I think we can forget how absolutely terrifying it is. And I remember one person in one of the groups I conducted here saying at one point, it's all very well to talk about clashes of culture, but to be in one is terrifying. And I just want to put that in, and I think that is what makes it difficult to work through and to shift and to change perspective. Also remembering how it was in the 60s, 70s and 80s in Britain with all this stuff.
I suppose one of the things, maybe this speaks also a bit more to Ollie as well, which is that when one voice is raised, we tend to move back rapidly, leaving them exposed. And there's something about responsibility there where we can share the danger rather than just leave one person isolated saying something and then they become vilified. That, we have to have the courage to say, me too. I too found that difficult. I guess there have been things, even in, we've been together a very short time, but there have been things that you have been affected by, which, but you have silenced your response, not voiced it. And the you I'm talking to is everyone, not just the Pākehā, but the Pākehā and the Maori. We are all doing. I know I did.
Farhad is stirring us, I think, and we're just warming up. Just to reassure us, there will be other opportunities to continue this engagement. We have time at the moment for just the last question to Keith. Just one. John.
Kia ora, Farhad. First of all, let me say that I agree with everything you've said in your talk, in each particular. Okay? The second...
I think something bad's coming.
No, I followed your argument with enthusiasm, with enthusiastic understanding. So what I call biculturalism, which is an evolving, changing thing, is the answer to the multicultural problem that you spoke of. Okay. So what you're describing as problematic, the reduction to two, I'm thinking of as the answer to the decoupling of the cultural and the political. So biculturalism is a political term that describes a power relationship between the indigenous people and the colonizing people. And of course, this situation is very different from the UK, where the indigenous people and the dominant culture have a very different complex relationship. And I just wondered if you could comment a bit more about the coupling and decoupling of the political and the cultural. Thanks.
Not sure, but what you've just said has just kind of jogged my mind into thinking, well, here it's called biculturalism, but the anti-racist movement, which is sort of black and white, those are the key terms in it. So I'm just sort of recognizing there are affinities, although the terms are different, as affinities between that and this. I also recognize the necessity of the two black and white world that needs to exist as a moment in the process. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but yeah, okay.
Kia ora koutou. We're coming towards lunch, and before we do, it's my pleasure to thank Farhad for his contribution to our conference. But first,
Thank you. We need to end with a song.
well, and we will. Have no doubt about that. We'll probably end with two. Kia ora koutou. Would you like to offer your way out of it?
Yeah. This is actually a round. You should sing it with me. Now I walk in beauty. Beauty is before me. Beauty is behind me, above and below me. So maybe you can all learn it and then we sing it together because it sounds beautiful. Not now.
Kia ora. So in thanking you, Farhad, I too was reflecting on the meaning of your talk for this conference and for the context of Aotearoa. And certainly Aotearoa and this association, this conference, I think has struggled a great deal with both the injunctions of and the reactions to the notions of biculturalism. Partly, I think, because of a lot of what you've offered us, that there has been a collapsing of notions of power and notions of culture in quite a simplistic way into the word biculturalism. What I think you've offered us, which I think is a wonderful new horizon for us, is that what we need in that engagement is not less discrimination, but more discrimination. And that discrimination requires us not to avoid engagement with difference, but to more deeply engage with that difference, bringing all of our discriminating capacities to that conversation. And I think that's an enormously rich offering for us at this conference, in our association and in our country. Kia ora koutou. And I'm going to
it's a big box of chocolates.
Well, I'm going to invite Farhad to find out what is in the box in front of us.
Oh, okay.
That is a tradition.
I'm not sharing. Are you tense? Ooh. Ooh.